12,000 years ago, something happened that nearly ended the story of humanity. Imagine seas rising higher than skyscrapers, forests set ablaze by fire raining from the sky, and entire continents reshaped in the span of a single lifetime. This wasn't a slow drift of history. It was sudden, violent, and world-changing. Cultures vanished. Animals that had ruled the Ice Age disappeared forever. And yet in the ruins, survivors whispered of floods so vast that they drowned the earth itself. Those whispers became myths, of Noah, of Atlantis, of Manu guided by a giant fish, of gods who punished with water. But what if these myths are not stories at all, but memories? What if the Great Flood was real, and its cause still hides in the scars of our planet? Was it ice melting and lakes bursting? Was it fire from the heavens? Or was it something even more mysterious, something that could erase entire civilizations without leaving a trace? Tonight, let us journey into one of the deepest enigmas of human history. Come with me, and together we will explore the secrets of what really caused the Great Flood of 12,000 years ago. 13,000 years ago, the Earth was a planet in transition. Vast ice sheets still gripped the northern hemisphere, stretching down across what is now Canada, the northern United States, and much of northern Europe. These glaciers were staggering in scale, walls of ice more than a mile thick, pressing down on the land, reshaping mountains, carving valleys, and holding within them an unimaginable volume of water. To stand at the edge of such a sheet would have been to face a horizon of white cliffs, silent and immovable, a frozen ocean on land. Yet the world was not only frozen. At the margins of the ice, new life was beginning to stir. Forests spread northward as the climate slowly warmed after tens of thousands of years of bitter cold. Herds of animals roamed the open plains, mammoths with spiraling tusks, mastodons with heavy jaws, and the giant bison, whose herds once thundered like storms across the grasslands. Saber-toothed cats prowled the edges, while enormous ground sloths lumbered in the Americas. It was an age of giants, an ecological richness unlike anything we see today. Humans were everywhere, though never in large numbers. In Europe, the Magdalenian culture painted intricate scenes of bison and horses in the depths of caves, illuminated by the flicker of fat-fed lamps. These images, in Lascaux, in Chauvet, in Altamira, are not mere art. They are windows into minds alive in a world of ice. In the Near East, the Natufians gathered wild grains, ground them with stone mortars, and began to linger in permanent or semi-permanent camps. These were the seeds of agriculture, fragile but real, laid down on landscapes that seemed stable and fertile. In North America, the Clovis people hunted mammoths with fluted spear points so finely crafted that archaeologists still marvel at their balance of form and function. Across Asia, communities adapted to steppe and tundra, following herds and rivers. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples passed down stories of a land already tens of thousands of years old, binding memory to myth in ways that still echo today. What united these cultures was not geography or language, but dependence. Dependence on stable seasons, on predictable rivers, on the slow, cautious rhythm of warming that had been unfolding since the Ice Age reached its peak. For generations, the Earth seemed to be offering abundance. The ice was retreating, grasslands were flourishing, rivers swelled with fish, lakes teemed with waterfowl, and forests spread into places that had been barren tundra. To the people of that time, it must have seemed that the hardest age had passed, and that a gentler one was arriving. Yet beneath this fragile balance lay instability. Today, we know this because the Earth has kept its memory in ice. In Greenland and Antarctica, scientists drill deep cores, extracting cylinders of frozen history. Each layer of ice holds within it tiny bubbles of air, pollen grains, and chemical signatures that record ancient climates with astonishing precision. These cores reveal that the warming at the end of the last ice age was not a smooth, gradual ascent. Instead, it was punctuated by sharp, almost violent swings. Within a decade, temperatures could rise or fall by as much as 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. For a hunter-gatherer society, such swings were more than inconvenience. A decade of warmth could bring rivers swollen with salmon and forests rich with deer. A sudden return of cold could strip that away within a generation, freezing rivers, shortening summers, and driving herds to extinction. A child could grow up in one world while their own children would face another entirely. The predictability that humans depend on to settle, to farm, to store food, all of it could vanish in the span of a lifetime. Great lakes formed where meltwater pooled against the edges of ice sheets. Lake Agassiz in North America stretched across 500,000 square kilometers, larger than all the Great Lakes combined. Its waters were held in place only by unstable walls of ice and earth. Similar lakes appeared across Eurasia, reservoirs of potential energy waiting to be released. Though they seemed calm, these lakes were time bombs. If their dams gave way, the floodwaters would roar across continents. Even before the Great Collapse, the presence of such lakes signaled that the world was precarious. We can imagine what this meant for daily life. A group of hunters might return to a familiar valley, only to find it transformed into a lake. A settlement near the coast might see its shoreline creeping inward each season. Families might pass down warnings of winters that never ended, of summers that failed, of rivers that grew too strong to cross. These would not be myths yet, but memories. Memories that would later solidify into stories when the world truly drowned. At this point in history, humanity stood on a threshold. Archaeological evidence suggests increasing complexity. Trade networks carrying obsidian blades hundreds of miles from their source. Ornaments and shells travelling inland. Ochre pigments exchanged between groups. Even without farming, humans were weaving webs of connection across continents. The seeds of civilization were present, not yet sprouted, but waiting. To us, looking back, it is almost painful to see how close they were. The Natufians nearly crossed the line into agriculture. The Clovis nearly built a tradition that could have lasted centuries. The Magdalenian artists nearly handed us a continuous thread of culture stretching back into the Ice Age. But all of this would be shattered, interrupted by forces too immense to resist. The world before the waters was a world of promise. Ice retreating, forests advancing, animals plentiful, humans thriving in diverse cultures. But it was also a world perched on the edge of collapse, its stability an illusion. The glaciers were melting, the lakes were swelling, the atmosphere was restless. The planet itself was primed for upheaval. To understand the great flood that would come, we must linger here, at this moment before, to see the richness that was lost, the seeds that were planted, the promise that was never fully realized. For when the flood arrived, it did not simply drown land, it drowned possibility, silencing cultures before they could flower, erasing histories before they could be written. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all, that our story might not have begun where we think it did, but restarted on ruins hidden beneath the sea. The calm that followed the slow retreat of the ice was shattered almost in an instant. For generations, people across the northern hemisphere had known a world that was becoming warmer, wetter, more abundant. Trees were advancing, rivers swelling with fish, game spreading across grasslands. Then within the span of a human lifetime, everything reversed. Bitter cold surged back, storms grew violent, summers collapsed into brief shadows, and winters returned with a ferocity not seen in thousands of years. The earth had lurched into crisis, and humanity was caught in the middle. This abrupt reversal is what scientists call the Younger Dryas. Beginning about 12,800 years ago, it plunged much of the planet into a 1,000-year cold snap. Ice cores drilled from Greenland reveal the drama with startling clarity. Within layers of compressed snow, preserved like pages of a diary, lie bubbles of ancient air. Analyzing them, scientists can read the chemistry of the past atmosphere. What they discovered is staggering. Temperatures in the North Atlantic region dropped by as much as 15 degrees Celsius in less than a century, perhaps even in just a few decades. To us, such numbers sound abstract, but imagine this in human terms. A family born into a warming, fertile world could see their children grow up in a landscape frozen and hostile, where rivers locked in ice and summers were too short to sustain crops. The Younger Dryas was global in scope, though its impacts varied by region. In Europe, pollen records extracted from ancient lake beds show forests retreating almost overnight. Birch and pine gave way to tundra plants like dwarf willow and Arctic sedges. The landscapes of France, Germany, and the British Isles turned back into windswept, treeless expanses, undoing centuries of ecological progress. In the Near East, where the Natufians had begun to experiment with tending wild grains, desiccation and cold killed their harvests. Archaeological sites tell the story. Villages once showing signs of permanence were abandoned, mortars and grinding stones left behind as their owners returned to nomadism. Farming was delayed for centuries, its fragile first steps undone by a sudden climatic slap. In North America, the Clovis people faced an even harsher disruption. They had mastered the hunting of Ice Age giants, mammoths, mastodons, giant bison. Their fluted spear points, chipped with breathtaking skill, were perfectly designed for piercing thick hides. But as the Younger Dryas struck, those animals disappeared. The extinction of megafauna is one of the great mysteries of this age, and while overhunting may have played a role, the timing aligns too closely with environmental catastrophe to ignore. Imagine a culture built on hunting mammoths, suddenly stripped of its prey. The archaeological record shows Clovis sites vanishing just as the Younger Dryas begins, their tools buried in silence. Further evidence comes from sediments and ice itself. Dust deposits in Greenland's cores thickened dramatically, suggesting fierce winds scoured the land and carried soil for miles. Layers of volcanic ash mingle with soot, telling of firestorms that raged even in the cold. Across North America, a strange layer of darkened soil appears, called the black mat. Rich in charcoal and microscopic debris, it suggests a continent-wide episode of burning. Forests ignited, prairies consumed. To live through this would have been to see the sky darken, the sun dimmed to a red ember by smoke. Glacial lakes added their own terror. Hemmed in by ice, they swelled to unimaginable size. Lake Agassiz alone stretched across more than 500,000 square kilometers, dwarfing any modern lake. When such ice dams broke, torrents of fresh water poured into the oceans, disrupting currents like the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the great conveyor belt that carries tropical warmth north. Oceanography supports this. Cores drilled from the seafloor reveal sudden pulses of fresh water coinciding with the Younger Dryas onset. The system faltered, the north chilled, and glaciers that had been retreating surged forward once again. For people alive at the time, these events would not have been abstract climatology. They were lived experience. Camps flooded, valleys locked in permafrost, herds disappeared, storms tore across the land with a violence no one could predict. Oral traditions, fragile and mutable, would have been shaped by these shocks. How else could one explain such a betrayal of the natural order except through stories of gods angered, of cosmic battles, of floods and fires unleashed to punish humankind? The scale of ecological collapse was immense. In North America alone, more than 35 genera of large mammals vanished forever. Mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, and enormous beavers all disappeared within a geological blink. Their loss reshaped ecosystems, altering vegetation, river patterns, and even soil composition. Humans who had relied on these animals not just for food but for materials, bone for tools, hide for clothing, sinew for thread, faced cascading hardship. Genetic studies echo the trauma. Ancient DNA from both humans and animals shows bottlenecks during this period. Sharp contractions in population sizes. Survivors carried their genes forward, but entire lineages were erased. These genetic scars are like fingerprints of catastrophe, mirroring the archaeological silence left by cultures like the Clovis. And yet, amidst the silence, we sense resilience. Some groups adapted by shifting diets, moving into new territories, or returning to foraging routes. Others may have clustered in refuges, preserving fragments of knowledge and memory. The Natufians would eventually try again, replanting the seeds of agriculture once the climate stabilized. The disappearance of old traditions opened space for new ones to emerge. The Younger Dryas remains one of Earth's great riddles. What caused it? Was it the sudden release of meltwater disrupting currents? Was it cosmic fire raining from the sky? Or some intricate dance within Earth's climate system? The evidence points in many directions, but the result is clear. A millennium of chaos, a crucible in which cultures cracked, ecosystems collapsed, and humanity itself was forced to adapt or vanish. If the Great Flood of 12,000 years ago has a root, it lies here, in this sudden return of ice and storm. For it was in this crucible that waters swelled behind glaciers, waiting to burst free, and that survivors carried memories that would one day become myths. The world at the close of the Ice Age was held together by walls of ice. Towering sheets stretched across continents, their edges fragile, riddled with meltwater channels and deep crevasses. At their margins, immense lakes pooled, fed by the torrents of glaciers in retreat. These lakes were not like the ones we know today. They were inland seas, holding volumes of water greater than modern oceans could absorb without consequence. To early humans, they must have seemed eternal, calm giants reflecting the pale sky. Yet each one was a disaster waiting to be released. One of the greatest of these was Lake Agassiz, a body of water so vast it dwarfed the Great Lakes combined. At its height, it covered more than 500,000 square kilometers, stretching across what is now Canada and parts of the northern United States. To stand on its shore was to look across an inland ocean, its far side lost in haze. But unlike an ocean, Lake Agassiz was fragile. Its only walls were frozen barriers of ice, held together by cold alone. Once those barriers cracked, there was nothing to stop the deluge. We know this not from myth, but from geology. Across the plains of Canada and the northern United States lie enormous spillways, channels carved into bedrock, dry now but vast enough to carry rivers many times greater than the Amazon. Giant boulders sit stranded on hillsides, lifted and hurled by currents so powerful they treated stone as driftwood. These are the scars of outburst floods, sudden releases of water when glacial dams failed. Lake Missoula in present-day Montana tells a similar story. It was smaller than Agassiz, but no less destructive. Trapped behind an ice dam, it filled and refilled repeatedly. Each time the dam failed, a torrent swept across the Pacific Northwest, scouring the land in hours. Imagine a wall of water 300 feet high thundering across valleys, travelling at highway speeds. It ripped soil from the ground, carved out coulees and dry falls, and left behind the bizarre scablands of Washington state. These landscapes are so extreme that early geologists refused to believe floods could explain them. Only after decades of debate and mounting evidence of massive ripple marks, stranded boulders, and sudden erosional features did the truth emerge. Cataclysm, not gradual change, had shaped the land. The Missoula floods were not a one-time event. Geological records show they happened dozens of times over thousands of years. Each time the ice dam reformed, the lake refilled, and each time it failed again, unleashing chaos. For early humans living in the region, these were not abstract forces. Camps, hunting grounds, and river crossings would have been obliterated in hours. Oral traditions among native tribes of the Northwest speak of water that chased people up the mountains, of valleys filled with roaring seas. These may be distant memories of the floods themselves, encoded into story. Europe had its own hidden catastrophes. As glaciers melted, proglacial lakes formed in valleys from the Alps to Scandinavia. When their dams failed, floods roared through river systems, reshaping landscapes like the Rhine and Danube. In Siberia, floods from collapsing ice barriers sent torrents across tundra plains, leaving behind channels so broad they are visible from space. Even the English Channel may have been carved in part by catastrophic flooding when meltwater broke through natural barriers that once connected Britain to the continent. Scientists studying these events rely on more than landscapes. Sediments tell the same tale. In Washington, thick layers of gravel and silt alternate with layers of fine lake sediment, evidence of repeated flooding. In marine cores from the North Atlantic, spikes of freshwater appear suddenly, coinciding with meltwater surges. These interruptions in ocean chemistry likely disrupted the great conveyor belt of currents, cooling the northern hemisphere and contributing to the Younger Dryas freeze. To picture these floods is to understand their violence. Imagine standing in a valley, hearing a distant roar that grows until the air itself vibrates. A wall of water appears, carrying icebergs, trees, and boulders in its churning mass. In minutes, everything is swept away: soil, animals, people. When the waters recede, the land is unrecognizable, stripped bare, gouged into new shapes, seeded with stones from faraway places. For survivors, the memory of such an event would be impossible to forget. The scale also explains the persistence of flood myths. Cultures that experience such destruction would pass the story to their children, who would pass it to theirs. Over centuries, the details blurred. Gods and symbols replaced descriptions of ice dams and torrents. But the core remained. The world drowned. Only a few survived, and everything had to begin again. The rupture of ice-dammed lakes is one of the most tangible mechanisms behind the Great Flood. It links the geological record with human memory. It shows how natural processes, triggered by climate change at the end of the Ice Age, could create cataclysms that looked and felt like the end of the world. Yet for all its power, water alone may not tell the whole story. For some evidence suggests that something more sudden, more violent, struck from above. Fire as well as flood, the sky joining the ice in reshaping the earth. Across the frozen plains of North America, something strange is recorded in the soil. Archaeologists digging through layers of earth notice a thin black band that appears almost everywhere at the same depth, from the Great Plains to the Carolinas, from Canada to Mexico. This is not a coincidence of dirt or a quirk of local geology. It is what scientists call the black mat, a line in the earth that marks the boundary between one world and another. Beneath it lie the bones of mammoths, mastodons, and giant bison. Above it, silence. The layer is dark, rich in soot, nanodiamonds, and melted droplets of rock. Evidence of something that burned, something that shattered, something that arrived not from below, but from above. The Younger Dryas impact. Hypothesis suggests that around 12,800 years ago, fragments of a disintegrating comet or asteroid struck the Earth or exploded in the atmosphere, triggering fires, floods, and a cascade of environmental collapse. It is controversial, resisted by many in mainstream science, yet the clues are undeniable. Nanodiamonds are especially telling. They form only under extreme pressure and heat, conditions generated in cosmic impacts. Melt glass droplets, tiny spheres of rock fused and then cooled in an instant, are scattered across sites in North America and beyond. Magnetic spherules, rich in iron, litter the same horizon. Together they tell a story of sudden catastrophic heat. Consider what such an event would have looked like to those alive at the time. The sky itself igniting. A blinding streak of light racing across the heavens, followed by an explosion so powerful it turned night to day. Shockwaves flattening forests. Wildfires igniting across entire continents, choking the air with smoke. herds of animals scattering in panic, only to vanish as ecosystems collapsed. Rivers boiling as fragments crashed into ice sheets, sending meltwater torrents roaring across the land. For hunter-gatherers, there could be no explanation but divine wrath, gods or spirits tearing the heavens open in anger. We find echoes of this in myth. The Hopi remember fiery serpents that fell from the sky. Hindu texts describe stars cast down to earth, bringing destruction before renewal. In Norse tradition, fire is destined to sweep across the world during Ragnarok, just before its rebirth. These are not simple stories of morality. They carry the tone of memory, of trauma, passed down across millennia. The impact hypothesis also ties directly to water. If fragments struck the Laurentide ice sheet in North America, the heat of their explosions could have vaporized vast amounts of ice instantly. Imagine entire lakes evaporating in moments, glaciers destabilized, torrents unleashed. The sudden surge of meltwater into the North Atlantic would have disrupted ocean circulation, shutting down the currents that carried warmth northward and plunging Europe back into glacial cold. In this way, fire and ice were partners, one triggering the other, together creating the chaos of the Younger Dryas. The evidence is not confined to North America. Sites in Europe and the Middle East show similar anomalies, spikes of soot, carbon, and microscopic impact markers dating to the same period. At Abu Huraira in Syria, one of the world's earliest known farming villages, glassy spherules suggest buildings and fields were scorched by heat intense enough to melt stone. In Chile, thousands of miles away, sediment layers carry signs of burning from the same horizon. If true, this was not a local event. It was hemispheric, perhaps even global. Skeptics argue that natural wildfires or volcanism could explain some of the data. They caution against overreach, pointing out inconsistencies in dating or uneven distribution of markers. Yet the pattern remains. Everywhere one looks around 12,800 years ago, there is disruption, sudden extinctions, cultural collapse, evidence of burning, and the onset of 1,000 years of ice. It is too much to be dismissed as coincidence. Modern analogies help us grasp the scale. In 1908, a small comet or asteroid exploded over Tunguska in Siberia. The blast flattened more than 2,000 square kilometers of forest, releasing energy equal to hundreds of Hiroshima bombs. Yet Tunguska left no crater, only scorched earth and trees leveled outward like matchsticks. Now imagine an event many times larger, striking ice sheets the size of small continents. The devastation would not only be regional, it would alter global climate. For ancient peoples, the memory of fire from the sky would have been indelible. Oral traditions could carry it forward, reshaped into tales of gods casting down thunderbolts or serpents of flame. Symbols carved in stone could preserve its image. The vulture stone at Göbekli Tepe, with its strange arrangement of animals and celestial motifs, has been interpreted by some as a star map, a record of a comet strike written in symbols 10,000 years ago. Whether or not this reading is correct, the possibility that such knowledge was encoded in art adds another dimension to the story. Survivors trying to leave warnings for the future. What makes this hypothesis compelling is not only the physical evidence, but the convergence of myth, archaeology, and geology. Each discipline whispers a piece of the same story: sudden fire, sudden flood, sudden silence. The earth itself bears the scars, and human memory preserved them in story. If floods alone could carve the scablands and drown Doggerland, fire from the sky could explain the burning, the extinctions, the abruptness. Together they sketch a picture of catastrophe at a scale we struggle even to imagine. And yet, for those alive then, it was not imagination. It was lived experience. The sky breaking open, the ground consumed, the world remade. When we think of the end of the Ice Age, it is easy to imagine a slow thaw, glaciers retreating like melting snowbanks, the seas rising gently over thousands of years. The truth was far less forgiving. Global sea levels did climb by more than 120 meters from the peak of the Ice Age to the beginning of the modern era. But much of that rise came in sudden pulses, violent surges that redrew coastlines in a single lifetime. These surges were the silent killers of human history, sweeping away entire landscapes, and with them the memory of peoples who once thrived along the shores. The evidence comes not only from maps of drowned continental shelves, but from the ocean itself. Coral reefs serve as timekeepers of sea level. As the water rises, corals grow upward toward the light. In reefs around Tahiti and Barbados, scientists have drilled cores and found growth rings stacked like tree trunks, interrupted by sudden leaps. In some cases, sea levels jumped several meters within a century. Imagine standing in a coastal village, watching the tide creep further inland each year, and then, after one great storm, finding your entire homeland swallowed. These were not imperceptible changes. They were catastrophes unfolding in human time. Beneath the North Sea lies Doggerland, once a vast plain connecting Britain to continental Europe. Rich in rivers, marshes and forests, it was home to deer, aurochs and human communities who fished and hunted across its fertile expanse. Archaeologists reconstruct it as a landscape of lakes and estuaries, a paradise for Mesolithic peoples. Yet as the seas rose, Doggerland shrank until only Dogger Bank, now a shallow sandbar, remained above the waves. Today, fishermen still dredge up harpoons carved from antler, stone tools, and the bones of mammoths from its drowned floor. Each artifact is a fragment of a world lost to water. In Southeast Asia, Sundaland sprawled where Indonesia's scattered islands now lie. When sea levels were lower, it was a single continuous landmass, nearly the size of India, with broad river valleys, fertile plains, and long coastlines. As the oceans climbed, Sundaland fractured into islands, scattering human groups and forcing migrations. Oral traditions across the region preserve memories of drowned homelands and vanished lands beyond the horizon. Genetic studies even suggest that the dispersal of Austronesian peoples may have roots in this flooding, their migration patterns shaped by seas that rose to swallow their heartland. The story is similar elsewhere. Off India's western coast, the Gulf of Khambat has yielded sonar images of geometric patterns buried beneath thick sediment. Some researchers interpret these as the remains of ancient walls and streets, although debate continues. Whether natural or man-made, the timing of their submersion aligns with rapid sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age. In Japan, the Yonaguni Monument lies beneath 20 meters of water, its massive terraces and steps resembling a sunken temple. While many geologists argue it is a natural formation, the sharpness of its edges and the patterns of its platforms fuel speculation that it, too, may be a drowned relic of human activity. Even the Black Sea tells a tale of deluge. Around 5600 BC, Mediterranean waters are thought to have surged through the Bosporus, flooding the basin in what some call the Noah's Flood hypothesis. Before this, the Black Sea may have been a smaller freshwater lake. Rising seas transformed it into the saltwater expanse we know today, drowning settlements along its shores. Archaeologists have found traces of ancient habitation beneath its waters, adding weight to the idea that real events inspired later myths. In the Bahamas, submerged caves known as blue holes hold their own testimony. Stalactites within these caves were once exposed to air, growing drop by drop in open chambers. Today they lie drowned, their tips truncated by water levels that rose abruptly thousands of years ago. Each stalactite is a fossilized witness, marking the moment the seas claimed the caves. For early humans, the loss of coastlines was more than geography. It was the erasure of memory. Rivers, estuaries, and fertile deltas had drawn people to the edge of the sea since long before written history. These were the places where fish were plentiful, soils were rich, and trade was easiest. To lose them was to lose entire communities, rituals, and traditions. What we now see as continental shelves, sonar-mapped and silent, were once homelands. How many of humanity's first settlements now rest beneath 100 meters of water, sealed away with their tools, art, and stories? Flood myths from around the world may preserve fragments of this trauma. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia tell of coasts that once lay further out, now beneath the waves. Accounts that match geological reconstructions of post-glacial sea level rise. In Celtic lore, the land of Lyonesse is said to lie beneath the sea off Cornwall. In Tamil tradition, Kumari Kandam, a lost land south of India, was swallowed by the ocean. These stories, scattered across continents, may be poetic memories of very real drownings. For archaeologists, the challenge is daunting. The evidence of these vanished cultures lies underwater, covered by layers of sediment, difficult to access. Yet already, divers and sonar surveys have revealed enough to suggest that the floodwaters of 12,000 years ago did more than redraw coastlines. They may have erased the earliest experiments in urban life, the first temples, the first seafaring networks. If true, then the flood was not merely natural disaster, but a historical reset, a force that drowned the opening chapters of our story. The oceans rose, the lands drowned, and humanity was forced inland to higher ground. What remained were not thriving villages, but absences in the archaeological record, gaps where traditions vanish, technologies are forgotten, and silence replaces continuity. It is in those gaps that the true cost of the flood is revealed. Not only land lost, but memory itself washed away. Archaeology often unfolds like a tapestry. Each layer of soil, each scatter of tools, each hearth or burial adds a new thread, weaving a picture of continuity. Cultures adapting, innovating, and passing knowledge down through generations. Yet when we reach the horizon of the Younger Dryas, the tapestry frays. Threads break, patterns vanish. Entire ways of life seem to fall silent, as though a page of human history was ripped away. The Clovis culture of North America provides one of the most striking examples. Their distinctive fluted spear points are found from New Mexico to Nova Scotia, evidence of a people who thrived across an immense territory. These hunters were masters of the Ice Age giants, stalking mammoths, mastodons, and giant bison. Their tools were elegant, finely flaked, and adapted to pierce thick hides. For decades, archaeologists believed the Clovis represented the first great American culture. But then, around 12,800 years ago, the trail goes cold. Sites vanish. The spear points stop appearing in the soil. Within centuries, Clovis culture was gone. Why? Some argue overhunting played a role, that humans pushed mammoth populations beyond recovery. Others point to environmental collapse, floods, droughts, fire, and the Younger Dryas chill, stripping away the resources Clovis depended on. Still others see something more dramatic, linking their disappearance to the impact hypothesis, where cosmic fire ignited forests and destabilized ecosystems. Whatever the cause, the result is clear. A culture erased, leaving behind a sharp break in the record. The silence is not limited to North America. In the Levant, the Natufians were poised on the threshold of a revolution. They had begun to settle in stone houses, to harvest and store wild grains, and to bury their dead in cemeteries. Grinding stones and mortars litter their sites, testifying to an emerging relationship with agriculture. But when the Younger Dryas struck, the rains failed, the cold returned, and their crops withered. Archaeological evidence shows settlements abandoned, communities dispersing back into nomadic bands. Farming, which could have transformed human life millennia earlier, was delayed. It would not fully recover until the climate stabilized nearly 2,000 years later. The pattern repeats across continents. In Europe, the Magdalenian culture, famed for its cave art, contracted sharply. Paintings in Chauvet and Lascaux speak of communities with rich symbolic lives, but after the Younger Dryas begins, such sites diminish. Groups scattered, retreated, or disappeared entirely. In South America, archaeological layers suggest disruption as well, though the record remains fragmentary. In Australia, oral traditions preserved by Aboriginal peoples tell of rising seas that erased hunting grounds and forced migrations inland, memories that align eerily with geological evidence of drowned coastlines. Genetics adds another layer of testimony. Ancient DNA reveals population bottlenecks around this time, moments when human numbers shrank dramatically. Survivors carried their genes forward, but diversity narrowed. Some lineages were lost entirely. These genetic scars mirror the cultural silences, whole communities vanishing without descendants to carry on their ways. Material culture tells the same story. Stone tool traditions, once widespread and distinctive, vanish from the record. Ornament styles shift abruptly. Trade networks break down. Obsidian, shells, and ochre pigments that once moved hundreds of miles appear less frequently, as though the webs connecting groups had snapped. Where once there was exchange and continuity, now there is fragmentation and silence. The extinctions of megafauna compounded the crisis. The mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, and giant ground sloths were not only prey but pillars of ecosystems. Their loss reshaped landscapes. Grasslands gave way to forests, altering plant and animal distributions. For human cultures tied to these animals, the impact was catastrophic. Hunting strategies collapsed. Sources of food, tools, and clothing disappeared. Communities adapted where they could, shifting to smaller game, expanding fishing, gathering more plants. But some could not. For them, the disappearance of animals meant the disappearance of themselves. The archaeological record does not only record absences, sometimes it shows transition. Survivors reinventing themselves in the face of chaos. But these transitions are abrupt, suggesting not gradual evolution, but rupture. The Natufians falling back into mobility. The Clovis replaced by later traditions that look entirely different. The sudden emergence of new practices elsewhere, as though survivors carried fragments of knowledge into a world reset. To imagine the human experience of this collapse is to think beyond numbers and tools. Imagine a child growing up in a Natufian village, watching her family build stone houses and grind wild grains into flour, believing the world is changing forever. By the time she grows old, her children are wanderers again, their fields abandoned, their homes reduced to rubble. Or imagine a hunter on the American plains, skilled with a Clovis point, only to find the herds gone, his way of life impossible. These are not abstractions, they are lives interrupted. What makes these disappearances haunting is their timing. Just as humanity was on the verge of something greater, permanent villages, farming, symbolic complexity, the world shattered. Civilizations that might have risen early were erased before they had the chance. The Younger Dryas did not simply slow human progress, it reset it. Cultures vanished, leaving gaps in the archaeological record that even today feel like wounds. These gaps invite speculation. Were the Clovis and Natufians isolated experiments, undone by chance? Or were they the visible tips of a broader surge of human innovation, erased by flood and fire before it could fully bloom? Archaeologists remain cautious, but the silences themselves are provocative. If whole landscapes drowned, if coastlines shifted by hundreds of miles, how much evidence of early complexity now lies hidden beneath the sea? The disappearance of cultures during the Younger Dryas is not just a story of endings, but of absences. Absences that shape everything that followed. Humanity had to begin again, carrying only fragments of what was lost. And out of this silence, something remarkable emerged. New monuments, carved in stone, as though survivors were determined to preserve their memory in forms the flood could not erase. High on a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey lies a place that should not exist, at least not according to the timelines most historians once believed. Buried under layers of soil for thousands of years, Göbekli Tepe emerged in the 1990s as one of the most astonishing archaeological discoveries of the modern era. What archaeologists found was not a village, nor a farm, nor even a city. It was a temple, a monumental site of carved pillars, some rising over 16 feet tall, arranged in vast circles that predate Stonehenge by 7 millennia. The sheer audacity of Göbekli Tepe challenges everything we thought we knew about humanity at the end of the Ice Age. Dating to around 9600 BC, it was built by hunter-gatherers, people whom we imagine carrying stone tools and living in small mobile bands. Yet here they were, quarrying massive blocks of limestone, transporting them uphill and arranging them in carefully designed enclosures. Many of the stones are decorated with intricate carvings of animals, foxes, vultures, snakes, boars, scorpions, and abstract symbols whose meaning still eludes us. The artistry is precise and confident. Reliefs show animals in motion, leaping, slithering, swooping, with a vitality that suggests more than decoration. Some researchers believe these carvings encoded stories, cosmologies, or even astronomical observations. One pillar, known as the Vulture Stone, depicts a series of animals that some interpret as constellations, possibly recording a cometary impact around 10,900 BC, the same event hypothesized to have triggered the Younger Dryas. If so, Göbekli Tepe may not only be the world's first temple, but also its first record of cosmic catastrophe. The layout of the site deepens the mystery. The enclosures are circular, with twin central pillars flanked by surrounding stones. Archaeologists debate their function. Were they ceremonial spaces, gathering sites, or cosmic observatories? The central pillars often bear stylized human arms and hands, suggesting they may represent anthropomorphic beings, guardians, ancestors, or gods. Whatever their meaning, the effort required to build them points to a community organized around shared purpose. Hunter-gatherers, who typically lived in small groups, must have gathered in numbers of hundreds to quarry, transport, and raise the stones. Such coordination implies leadership, ritual, and perhaps trauma that bound survivors together. The timing of Göbekli Tepe's construction is equally striking. It rose from the ground at the exact moment the Younger Dryas ended, when the 1,000-year storm gave way to warming, when floods receded, when survivors could finally breathe again. Some scholars see this as no coincidence. After generations of chaos, perhaps communities built Göbekli Tepe as a place to restore order, to anchor memory in stone, to reconnect with the cosmos that had betrayed them. In this reading, the site is a monument to survival, a message that humanity endured and would not forget. Yet the greatest mystery of Göbekli Tepe may be its burial. Around 8000 BC, after centuries of use, the people who built it deliberately backfilled the enclosures with rubble, entombing the pillars and preserving them in pristine condition. Why would they hide their masterpiece? Some argue it was ritual closure, a way to mark the end of an era. Others suspect preservation, that the builders knew their world was fragile and buried Göbekli Tepe as a message for the future. If so, then we are the intended recipients, unearthing their warning 10,000 years later. Göbekli Tepe was not alone. The surrounding region, known as Taş Tepeler, the Stone Hills, is dotted with similar sites: Karahan Tepe, Harbetsuvan, Sefer Tepe. Karahan Tepe, only recently excavated, revealed a subterranean chamber filled with dozens of phallic pillars carved directly from bedrock. The repetition of design across multiple sites suggests Göbekli Tepe was not an anomaly, but part of a cultural horizon, a network of communities bound by shared ritual and symbolism. This was not the isolated effort of a single band of hunter-gatherers, but a cultural movement spanning centuries. Some archaeologists interpret Göbekli Tepe as the crucible of agriculture. They argue that rituals held there required large gatherings, which in turn demanded stable food supplies. Farming may have arisen to feed the builders, making religion the seed of agriculture rather than its product. If true, then civilization itself may have been born not in fields, but in sacred circles of stone. Others suggest the opposite, that Göbekli Tepe preserves fragments of knowledge from a forgotten world. In this view, its sudden sophistication is not invention from nothing, but survival, a cultural inheritance from people who lived before the flood. The carvings, the astronomical hints, the careful burial all become clues to an older legacy, carried forward by survivors determined not to let their past vanish. Scientific techniques have only deepened the intrigue. Ground-penetrating radar reveals more enclosures still buried beneath the hill, waiting to be uncovered. Analysis of animal bones at the site shows feasting on a massive scale, suggesting that Göbekli Tepe was a place of pilgrimage where groups gathered for ritual, memory, and perhaps renewal. Soil analysis reveals wild einkorn wheat growing nearby, the ancestor of domesticated wheat. Was this coincidence, or evidence of the first attempts at cultivation linked directly to the temple? To walk among the pillars today is to feel the weight of something uncanny. The stones rise in silence, their carvings sharp despite 10,000 years. The air feels heavy, as though the site remembers what it was built to preserve. Göbekli Tepe is not simply archaeology, it is testimony. Testimony that humanity, scarred by flood and fire, sought to anchor memory in stone, to create a monument that could withstand the erasure of water, ice, and time. In the silence left by vanished cultures, Göbekli Tepe speaks. It is the threshold between what was lost and what endured, between the disappearance of the Clovis and Natufians and the rebirth of complexity in the Holocene. It is a wound carved into limestone, a whisper from survivors who refuse to let their world be forgotten. And as its circles rise from the soil once more, they seem less like relics of a distant past and more like a message reaching across millennia. We remembered so that you would remember too. Across every continent, in languages now forgotten and in traditions still alive, humanity whispers the same haunting story. Once, the waters rose and the world was nearly destroyed. What is most astonishing is not that flood myths exist, for floods are common, but that they echo each other with such striking detail, even when the peoples who carried them were separated by oceans and millennia. The story is always the same: divine or cosmic warning, catastrophe by water, survival by a chosen few, and the rebirth of humanity in the aftermath. In Mesopotamia, one of the cradles of written civilization, the Epic of Gilgamesh preserves the tale of Utnapishtim. Warned by the gods of a deluge, he builds a massive boat, fills it with his family and animals, and survives as torrents cover the land. His vessel comes to rest on a mountain peak where he releases birds to test whether the waters have receded. These details are mirrored almost word for word in the Hebrew account of Noah's Ark, suggesting not coincidence but continuity, a shared memory carried across cultures. Even older, the Atrahasis epic repeats the same tale, linking divine punishment with survival by vessel. In Greece, the flood of Deucalion and Pyrrha tells the same story in Hellenic dress. When Zeus resolved to cleanse a corrupt humanity, he unleashed a flood. Deucalion and his wife survived in a wooden chest that floated for 9 days and nights until it rested on Mount Parnassus. Emerging into a silent world, they repopulated it by casting stones over their shoulders, which transformed into men and women. The symbolic rebirth echoes Mesopotamia, a mountain refuge, chosen survivors, humanity restarting after deluge. Hindu traditions offer another remarkable parallel. Manu, the first man, was warned by a great fish of a coming flood. He built a boat and tied it to the fish, who guided him safely through the rising waters to the Himalayas. After the flood, Manu became the father of a renewed human race. Again, the motifs are clear: a warning, a vessel, survival, and rebirth. This tale is embedded in some of the oldest Sanskrit texts, suggesting a memory carried across thousands of years. In the Americas, Far from the civilizations of the Old World, flood stories persist with the same resonance. The Hopi speak of multiple worlds destroyed in succession, one by fire, another by flood. In the Great Lakes region, the Ojibwe tell of a time when the earth was entirely submerged, and animals dove into the depths to retrieve soil to remake the land. The Muskogee Creek recount waters rising until people clung to the tallest trees. The theme is always annihilation followed by renewal, the flood as a cosmic reset. Even in Australia, Aboriginal traditions, among the oldest continuous oral cultures on Earth, describe rising seas that swallowed coastlines. These accounts align with geological reconstructions of post-glacial sea level rise, when coasts advanced inland by hundreds of kilometres. For the communities who lived through it, the loss of ancestral hunting grounds and sacred sites was remembered so vividly that the stories endured for over 10,000 years. Some traditions even describe islands becoming cut off from the mainland, which corresponds exactly to the creation of Australia's modern coastline. What makes these parallels extraordinary is not only their persistence but their specificity. Flood myths do not simply speak of water. They describe chosen survivors, vessels or arks, mountaintops as refuges, birds released to search for land. These motifs are too consistent to be dismissed as mere allegory. If floods are universal experiences, why not also myths of droughts, earthquakes, or volcanoes repeated across all cultures with the same precision? Why is it water, and not just water, but world-drowning water, that haunts humanity's oldest memories? Scholars often interpret flood myths symbolically. Water becomes chaos, a cleansing force, the destruction of the old to make way for the new. In many traditions, it represents divine punishment for human arrogance or corruption. Yet symbolism alone does not explain the uncanny overlap of details. When myths separated by oceans share images of boats, birds, mountains, and renewal, the simplest explanation may be that they recall real events. Science lends weight to this possibility. We know from geological evidence that seas rose dramatically at the end of the Ice Age, sometimes in catastrophic pulses. We know from the scablands and proglacial lakes that sudden outbursts could erase entire landscapes in days. We know from the black mat that fire and flood coincided around 12,800 years ago. These are the very conditions described in myth: the world drowning, the sky darkening, humanity forced to begin again. Perhaps oral tradition carried these memories across millennia. Anthropologists have shown that stories in oral cultures can preserve accurate details for astonishing lengths of time. Aboriginal Australian myths describing drowned coastlines align with sea level maps from 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. The detail is too precise to be coincidence. If such memory can endure in one culture, why not in others? Flood myths may also have served as warnings. Imagine a survivor of a deluge telling their children, and those children telling theirs, "The waters once rose and destroyed everything. Remember, be vigilant." Over centuries, details became mythologized, gods and spirits woven into the tale. But the essence survived. This would explain why flood stories are not cautionary tales of morality alone, but vivid recollections of annihilation. The global chorus of flood myths is one of the strongest hints that the Great Flood of 12,000 years ago was not only real, but remembered. From Mesopotamia to the Andes, from India to Australia, humanity carries fragments of the same nightmare, retold in different languages, but echoing the same truth. The world once drowned, and only a few survived. And if all these traditions are fragments of memory, then they point us towards something even more haunting. For if whole coastlines and cultures were swallowed, then their ruins must still lie beneath the waves, sunken cities and forgotten shores waiting in silence. When we gaze out over the sea today, it is easy to forget that not long ago those waters lay far lower, and what now appears as endless ocean was once dry land, alive with forests, rivers, and human settlement. At the height of the last ice age, so much water was locked in glaciers that coastlines stretched hundreds of kilometers farther out than they do now. Entire land bridges connected continents, and broad plains flourished where today only waves can be seen. As the ice melted, the oceans rose relentlessly, erasing those landscapes. What remains now are ghostly traces, drowned shorelines, strange structures glimpsed under the waves, and myths of lands that slipped beneath the sea. One of the most vivid examples is Doggerland, the Atlantis of the North Sea. For millennia, it was a green and fertile plain that stretched between Britain and continental Europe. Archaeologists reconstruct it as a landscape of rolling hills, meadows, and wetlands, traversed by rivers where red deer and wild cattle roamed. Fishing camps and hunting grounds must have dotted its banks. Yet as the seas rose, Doggerland shrank until, around 6,500 years ago, a sudden surge, perhaps triggered by the Storegga submarine landslide off Norway, sent giant waves crashing inland, drowning what remained. Today, the seabed still offers up its secrets. Harpoons carved from antler, flint tools, and the bones of mammoths and humans alike, pulled accidentally from fishing nets. Each artifact is a message from a lost world once walked by our ancestors. Far to the east, the drowned continent of Sundaland once covered much of modern Indonesia, Malaysia, and surrounding islands. 10,000 years ago, these were not scattered fragments of land, but a continuous expanse as large as Europe. Vast river valleys wound through fertile plains, supporting lush ecosystems and, very likely, thriving human populations. As the seas rose, Sundaland fractured into the islands we know today. Modern genetic studies trace the dispersal of Austronesian peoples back to this drowning, forced migrations that carried their languages and traditions across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Local myths speak of vanished lands and ancestral homelands swallowed by the sea, echoing the geological record of the region's inundation. In the Indian Ocean, tales of Kumari Kandam, a vast land south of India, may reflect similar memories of lost terrain. Off the coast of Gujarat, in the Gulf of Khambhat, sonar surveys have revealed geometric patterns beneath thick layers of silt. Some researchers interpret these as drowned settlements, with alignments resembling walls and streets. While debate continues over whether they are natural formations or human-made, their presence in a basin known to have been submerged after the Ice Age invites speculation. Did early urban experiments vanish here, buried beneath layers of mud and water? The Mediterranean too hides its mysteries. Along the coast of Greece, submerged ruins have been found beneath shallow waters, including the city of Pavlopetri off Laconia. Pavlopetri is later than the Younger Dryas, dating to around 5,000 years ago, but it demonstrates how easily entire settlements can vanish under rising seas. Might older sites lie deeper, awaiting discovery? The myth of Atlantis, recorded by Plato, speaks of a proud civilization swallowed by the ocean in a single day and night. While scholars debate its origins, the story fits into a broader pattern of cultural memory, lands lost suddenly to water. In the Pacific, the Yonaguni Monument off Japan's Ryukyu Islands adds another layer of enigma. Beneath 20 meters of water lies a massive stone formation with sharp terraces, steps, and what appear to be broad platforms. Many geologists insist it is natural, shaped by tectonic uplift and erosion. Yet the angles of its staircases, the symmetry of its plazas, and claims of carvings on its walls fuel speculation that it may be at least partly man-made. If it is, then its submersion corresponds neatly with the rapid sea level rise of the post-Ice Age world, when coastlines retreated inward by kilometers. Further west, the Persian Gulf once held a fertile plain at its center, where the Tigris and Euphrates joined before meeting the sea. Today it lies beneath shallow waters, but archaeologists suggest this Gulf oasis may have supported human settlement before being drowned. Intriguingly, this is the same region where Sumerian myths later told of Eridu, one of the first cities, and of floods sent by gods. Perhaps the cradle of Mesopotamian civilization stood quite literally upon drowned foundations. Even the Americas hold hints of forgotten shores. Off the coast of Cuba, sonar surveys in deep water have detected geometric features that some interpret as possible ruins. Though controversial and unconfirmed, the possibility that early Caribbean cultures were erased by rising seas cannot be dismissed. In South America, Lake Titicaca sits high in the Andes, but legends there recall a flood that once covered the land, from which Viracocha, the culture bringer, emerged. Might these highland myths preserve echoes of coastal floods that drove people inland? What unites these examples is not certainty but absence. We know the seas rose by more than 120 meters. We know countless coastal plains, deltas, and valleys were drowned. We know humans lived there because humans have always been drawn to the fertile edge between land and water. Yet most of that evidence lies hidden now, beneath mud and ocean, accessible only to the most difficult forms of archaeology. What we have are fragments, tools dragged up in nets, sonar images of strange patterns, half-drowned ruins discovered by divers. These fragments hint at entire chapters of human history written on shores that no longer exist. The myths of Atlantis, Lyonesse, Kumari Kandam, and countless others may not describe literal places, but they preserve the memory of loss. People remembered that once there was land, and then the land was gone. They remembered that the sea could erase in a moment what had seemed eternal. And those memories became legend, transformed into tales of punishment, hubris, or divine intervention. Yet beneath the allegory lies geology, the inescapable truth of oceans rising and swallowing the world. The drowned landscapes of Doggerland, Sundaland, and others are not fantasy. They are real, mapped, and confirmed. And they are only the beginning. For every submerged plain we know, there are dozens still hidden. Every coastline today was once many kilometers farther out. Every continental shelf was once homeland. Somewhere out there, beneath 100 meters of salt water, may lie not just scattered camps and villages, but the first temples, the first cities, the first seeds of civilization erased by the flood. When the waters receded and the skies cleared, humanity emerged into a world unrecognizable. Forests had burned, plains had drowned, herds had vanished. For many communities, survival meant starting again from nothing. Yet in the aftermath of this desolation, myths across the world describe something remarkable. Figures who appeared suddenly, bringing knowledge, order, and the spark of civilization. They are remembered as gods, sages, culture bringers, but perhaps they were survivors, carrying fragments of memory from worlds erased. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians spoke of the Anunnaki, powerful beings who ruled before kingship was handed to men. Among them was Oannes, described by the historian Berossus in the 3rd century BC. Oannes, half man and half fish, was said to rise from the Persian Gulf each morning. By day, he lived among humans, teaching them how to write, build cities, cultivate fields, and govern laws. By night, he returned to the sea. The description is mythic, but the pattern is clear. After the flood, someone came from the water with knowledge beyond the ordinary. The imagery of water may recall not only the sea itself, but the deluge from which civilization had to be rebuilt. Far across the world, in the high Andes of South America, the Inca and their predecessors remembered Viracocha. Emerging from Lake Titicaca after a great flood, he walked across the land, teaching survivors how to farm, craft, and live in harmony. Chroniclers described him as tall, bearded, and radiant, unlike the local people. Viracocha eventually departed across the Pacific, promising to return. His role mirrors that of Oannes. He comes from water after disaster, bearing knowledge that resets humanity. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, played a similar role. Though worshipped as a god, he was also remembered as a teacher who introduced agriculture, laws, and astronomy. Myths tell of earlier worlds destroyed in cataclysm, including by flood, after which Quetzalcoatl restored order. Among the Maya, the same figure appears as Kukulkan. Across cultures separated by oceans, the image repeats. A luminous being, half human, half other, guiding shattered peoples into new ways of life. Even in North America, flood survivors are not left unaided. The Hopi speak of the Ant People, who sheltered humanity underground when the world above was destroyed. When it was safe to return, they guided humans back to the surface, teaching them how to plant and survive. Among the Sioux, tales describe White Buffalo Calf Woman, a divine teacher who brought sacred rites after a time of upheaval. Again, the motif surfaces. After destruction, instruction. The parallels grow harder to dismiss. Why should cultures so distant, with no contact, share the same structure of story? Catastrophe, flood or fire, survivors clinging to life, and then a figure who teaches, who restores, who sets the pattern for civilization. Archaeology offers context. Sites like Göbekli Tepe suggest that within a few centuries of the Younger Dryas, survivors were building monuments far beyond what hunter-gatherers were supposed to achieve. The sudden leap hints that knowledge was preserved and reintroduced rather than discovered anew. Trade networks re-emerged with surprising speed, as seen in obsidian blades carried hundreds of miles, or shells found deep inland. Symbolic systems, carvings, figurines, astronomical alignments appear almost fully formed. This discontinuity makes sense if survivors carried cultural memory across the reset, teaching others what had once been known. Even the details in myths suggest encoded history. Oannes is half man, half fish, a symbol for knowledge arriving by sea, perhaps from drowned coastal peoples who moved inland. Viracocha emerges from a lake, water as the womb of rebirth after the deluge. Quetzalcoatl is feathered and serpentine, sky and earth united, a bridge between worlds. These symbolic costumes may mask real humans whose knowledge seemed godlike to traumatized survivors. Over generations, memory blurred into myth, but the core remained. They came after the flood, and they taught. Scientific evidence adds depth. Genetic studies show that populations did not vanish entirely during the Younger Dryas. Bottlenecks occurred, but survivors endured. Some lineages spread rapidly afterward, consistent with migration and resettlement. Linguistic patterns, too, suggest expansions dating back to this era. Families of languages fanning outward from refugees, like echoes of survivors carrying their words across new landscapes. Could these be the traces of the very culture bringers later remembered as gods? Skeptics argue that these figures are archetypes born from human imagination. After trauma, it is natural to tell stories of saviors, of teachers who restore order. Yet why should such archetypes converge so precisely across continents? Why should they all follow cataclysm? Why should they emerge from water? Why should they teach agriculture, astronomy, and law? The consistency feels less like invention and more like memory refracted through myth. Perhaps the most haunting thought is this: if teachers appeared, it means there was something to teach. Knowledge does not spring from nothing. Agriculture, architecture, astronomy, these may have been the salvaged fragments of civilizations drowned by the flood. If so, then Oannes, Viracocha, Quetzalcoatl, and their kin are not gods at all, but the last emissaries of forgotten worlds, remembered in reverence by those who rebuilt in their shadow. The deluge destroyed much, but it did not erase everything. Fragments survived, carried by wandering teachers, preserved in stone circles, whispered in myth, and it is through these echoes that we glimpse the possibility that before us there were others. Civilizations erased, whose memory endures only in the stories of luminous beings who came after the flood. The story of the Great Flood is not only told in stone, sediment, and myth. It is also fought over in classrooms, conferences, and bookshelves. Few topics in archaeology and geology ignite as much passion as the Younger Dryas and its possible connection to humanity's lost past. For some, the evidence is clear. Abrupt climate change, catastrophic floods, cultural collapses, and a global trauma remembered in myths. For others, this is a dangerous blend of speculation and romance, where the hunger for mystery overshadows rigorous science. And so, the debate itself has become a battleground between orthodoxy and what critics call heresy. The roots of this divide go back more than a century. In the 1920s, J. Harlenbretz shocked the geological world with his claim that the bizarre, channeled scablands of Washington state were formed not by slow erosion, but by sudden cataclysmic floods. For decades, his peers mocked the idea. Catastrophism, the notion that sudden disasters shaped Earth's history, was considered outdated. Gradualism, the belief that landscapes formed slowly over vast time, was the reigning dogma. But in the 1970s, Bretz was vindicated. Evidence proved that repeated outburst floods from glacial Lake Missoula had scoured the land in days, creating channels, dry falls, and giant ripple marks. What was once dismissed as heresy is now geological fact. This episode remains a cautionary tale. How often science resists catastrophe until the evidence becomes overwhelming. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis has revived this old conflict. In 2007, a group of scientists led by Richard Firestone and Alan West argued that a fragmented comet or asteroid struck the Earth 12,800 years ago, triggering continent-wide fires and a sudden return to glacial conditions. They pointed to nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, and melt glass as evidence. Critics immediately countered that the data was inconsistent, that sampling was flawed, that no crater had been found. The debate has raged ever since, with papers published, retracted, and rebutted, each side accusing the other of bias. For some, the impact hypothesis explains too much to ignore: the black mat, the extinctions, the sudden cooling. For others, it reeks of overreach, a search for drama rather than truth. The controversy extends beyond geology into archaeology. Robert Schoch, a geologist, stunned the world in the 1990s by claiming that the weathering on the Sphinx of Giza was caused not by desert winds, but by heavy rainfall. If correct, the Sphinx would date back to the end of the Ice Age, thousands of years before Pharaonic Egypt. Schoch argued that only sustained rain, last seen in Egypt during the early Holocene, could produce the rounded erosion patterns on the monument's body and enclosure walls. Egyptologists rejected the idea, insisting the Sphinx dates to Pharaoh Khafre around 2500 BC. Yet the debate continues, fueled by the absence of definitive inscriptions linking the Sphinx to any known ruler. Here too, the accusation is the same. Are we protecting evidence or protecting a timeline? Figures like Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson have amplified these disputes to global audiences. Hancock, in Fingerprints of the Gods and Magicians of the Gods, argues that a forgotten civilization perished in the cataclysm of the Younger Dryas, leaving behind scattered monuments and myths. He sees Göbekli Tepe as the smoking gun, a site so advanced, so early, that it can only be the legacy of survivors. Carlson, a geologist, points to megaflood features across North America, to drumlins and erratics deposited by catastrophic currents as proof that the Earth convulsed violently at the end of the Ice Age. Together, they challenge the linear model of history, proposing instead that civilization is older, interrupted, and repeatedly erased. Mainstream scholars push back forcefully. Archaeologists caution that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. They note that myths are malleable, that Göbekli Tepe could represent innovation rather than inheritance, that absence in the record does not prove lost civilizations. They warn that alternative theories, however compelling, risk confusing the public by blurring the line between fact and speculation. Yet at the same time they cannot deny the anomalies. The suddenness of the Younger Dryas, the black matte horizon, the abrupt extinctions, the enigmatic ruins that seem to appear out of nowhere. The debate is not just academic, it reflects two ways of seeing the past. One side insists on caution, on building history stone by stone from verifiable evidence. The other embraces mystery, seeing in gaps and anomalies the fingerprints of something more. Both sides are necessary, the rigour of science and the imagination of inquiry. Yet the friction between them reveals how fragile our understanding of deep history truly is. What complicates matters further is the public's hunger for meaning. Lost civilizations, cosmic impacts, and floods that reset humanity capture imagination in a way that pollen counts and isotope ratios never could. Popular fascination drives books, documentaries, and debates online, forcing academia to respond. Some scholars dismiss this as pseudo-history, but others quietly acknowledge that questions raised by so-called heretics keep important conversations alive. In truth, the flood debate mirrors the very themes it studies: erasure, survival, and memory. Orthodoxy guards the official story, wary of chaos. Alternative thinkers carry the fragments of forbidden possibility, risking scorn to preserve them. The tension between the two ensures that the mystery remains alive, unresolved, and endlessly compelling. The scars of the Younger Dryas are real: canyons carved by sudden floods, soot-stained soils, cultures that vanish from the record. Whether we see in them the mark of ordinary catastrophe or the echo of a forgotten civilization depends on how we choose to read the evidence. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between, where science and myth, fact and imagination overlap like two layers of sediment pressed together in the same core. The story of the Great Flood is not only a tale of the past. Its echoes roll forward into our own age, carried in stone, in story, and in the rising waters of today. For while we may speak of the Younger Dryas as a distant cataclysm, its lesson is one of fragility. How swiftly abundance can turn to ruin, how easily seas can rise and redraw the map of human existence. Modern science measures change with satellites and sensors, charting each centimetre of sea level rise. Yet the numbers on charts mask a more visceral truth. Coastal villages swept away by storms, islands losing ground each year, families forced inland as salt poisons their fields. To those who live by the shore today, the ocean already feels alive, creeping forward just as it once did 12,000 years ago. The parallels are haunting. Then the survivors wove memory into myth. Utnapishtim, Noah, Manu, Deucalion, the Hopi Ant People. Today we watch cities like New Orleans, Jakarta and Venice wrestle with water, wondering what myths our descendants will inherit. Just as Doggerland drowned, our own coastlines may vanish, leaving behind ruins beneath waves, ready to be rediscovered by some future archaeologist. Archaeology teaches us that silence can be as telling as discovery. The gaps after the Younger Dryas hint at civilizations erased before they had the chance to mature. Could we too become a silence in the record, reduced to plastic remnants and radioactive dust pressed into sediment? If so, our myths may be the last fragile vessels of memory, carried like the flood stories that endured for millennia. Perhaps that is the true gift of the ancient tales, not proof of gods or cosmic punishments, but reminders. Reminders that the world has ended before and may end again. That what we build can be undone in a single lifetime. That survivors always emerge carrying fragments forward, transforming trauma into story and story into warning. And so the cycle turns. Fire, water, ice, renewal. Time folding back on itself, erasing, then revealing. The ruins of Göbekli Tepe, the scars of the Scablands, the drowned valleys beneath the sea, all stand as portals, whispering across millennia. They tell us that the flood was real, and that its cause may never be singular. It was water and ice, fire and sky, myth and memory woven together into a tapestry too vast for one answer. Somewhere in those echoes lies the truth of what really caused the Great Flood of 12,000 years ago. But perhaps the more haunting truth is that the flood is not finished. It lingers in our present, rising in tides, reflected in myths, waiting in the silence between waves. If these mysteries stir something in you, if you sense the weight of forgotten chapters and the fragility of what we call civilization, then journey with us further. Like the storytellers who preserved the memory of the last deluge, we too must carry these echoes forward. Where are you listening from tonight, and at what time?